Imagine standing on the deck of a pirate ship with a rusty blade pressed against your throat. And the only thing you can think about is how insulted you are by your own price tag. That was the reality for a young 25-year-old Roman nobleman named Julius Caesar in the year 75 before the Common Era. Most people in that situation would be weeping or bargaining for their lives. But Caesar was built differently, and by differently, I mean he probably had a few screws loose. Which is exactly why we are here at Problematic Geniuses to talk about the man who basically ego-tripped his way into becoming a god. We often look at history through these polished marble lenses as if every great move was a stroke of calculated brilliance, but if you look closer, you start to see that some of Caesar's most iconic victories were actually just incredibly dumb tactics that absolutely should not have worked. He was a raging alcoholic with a chip on his shoulder the size of the Colosseum, and a habit of taking everything personally, which makes him the perfect subject for us. Before we dive into the madness of how this man turned the Mediterranean into his personal playground, do me a favor and hit that like button and follow the channel if you want to see more stories about the dirty and completely insane side of the minds that shaped our world. The pirate incident is the gold standard for Caesar's brand of problematic behavior. When the Sicilian pirates boarded his ship and took him captive, they decided to set a ransom for 20 talents of silver, which was roughly $2 million in today's money. For any normal hostage, that is a terrifying sum. But when Caesar heard the number, he didn't feel fear. He felt offended. He actually laughed in their faces and told them they had no idea who they were dealing with. He demanded they up the ransom to 50 talents because in his mind he was way more valuable than some low-level noble. Imagine being so arrogant that you tell your kidnappers to charge your family more money just to satisfy your ego. He sent his entourage away to gather the cash and stayed behind on the island hideout with just a few servants. But he didn't act like a prisoner. He acted like the pirates were his personal staff. He would freely walk around the camp and join in on their games and even exercise with them. The most unhinged part was that he forced these hardened criminals to sit down every single day and listen to the speeches and poems he was writing. If they didn't pay enough attention, or if they were too noisy while he was trying to work, he would shush them like a grumpy librarian. He even told them to their faces that they were all idiots for not appreciating his literary genius. Throughout his 38 days as a hostage, he would frequently joke that once he was set free, he was going to find them all and crucify them. The pirates just laughed it off because he was charismatic, and he was their ticket to a massive payday. But they really should have listened to the crazy guy. The second his men returned with the 50 talents, and he was released, Caesar didn't go home to rest. He immediately raised a small private army and sailed right back to that island. He took back every single coin of the ransom and captured every single pirate who had held him hostage. And because he was a man of his word and also a complete psychopath, he crucified all of them, just like he promised. To his credit, he did grow a little fond of them during his stay, so he had their throats slit first, so they wouldn't suffer for too long. If you think being kidnapped and then bossing around your kidnappers is the ultimate power move, drop a comment below because I'm still trying to decide if that was brilliant or just pure lunacy. This theme of doing the exact opposite of what a sane person would do followed Caesar into the Gallic Wars. By this time, he was trying to prove he was just as great as his hero Achilles, and he was willing to burn down half of Europe to do it. His conquest of Gaul was less about Roman safety and more about Caesar's personal brand. He was a master of the vibes check. One of his most famous and arguably most ridiculous tactics happened during the Siege of Alesia. He had the Gallic leader Vercingetorix trapped inside the city, but he soon got word that a massive relief army of 250,000 Gauls was coming to crush him from behind. At this point, any normal general would have retreated. You don't stay in the middle of a sandwich where you are the meat. But Caesar decided to double down. He ordered his men to build a wall around the city to keep the Gauls in, which is standard enough. But then he ordered them to build a second wall facing outward to keep the relief army out. He essentially built a donut of death and trapped his own army in the middle of it. It was a tactical nightmare that relied entirely on his men not panicking while being attacked from two sides at once. It was a massive gamble that should have ended in the total destruction of his legions. But because his men were terrified of him and his weirdly effective energy, they held the line. He would ride along the fortifications in his bright red cloak, making sure everyone could see him. And he would shout encouragement while the world was literally ending around them. It was a dumb plan that required an impossible amount of labor and luck, but it worked. And Vercingetorix was forced to surrender. His political life was just as messy and unhinged as his military campaigns. When he decided to cross the Rubicon, he wasn't just starting a civil war, he was breaking the most sacred law of the Roman Republic. It was a reckless move that put him in the position of an outlaw. He knew that the Senate's power was largely an illusion maintained by tradition, and he was the only one brave or stupid enough to just walk through the curtain. This brings us to the Battle of Pharsalus, where he went up against his former friend and rival Pompey the Great. Pompey had more men and more supplies and more cavalry. He had every advantage on paper. But Caesar knew that Pompey's cavalry was made up of young and vain Roman nobles who cared way too much about their looks. So Caesar came up with a tactic that sounds like a joke. He told his elite fourth line of infantry not to throw their javelins at the horses, but to aim directly for the faces of the young riders. He gambled that these pretty boys wouldn't want to get scars on their faces and would retreat to protect their looks. And it actually worked. The cavalry panicked and fled because they didn't want to lose their status as the hottest bachelors in Rome. It was a petty tactic for a petty man, and it won him the battle. That made him the master of the world. If you're enjoying this look into how vanity and ego changed history, make sure to follow the channel and like this video because the stories only get more problematic from here. Caesar's genius was inseparable from his complete lack of a filter. He did what he wanted when he wanted, and he didn't care who he offended in the process. When he got to Egypt, he got caught up in a civil war between Cleopatra and her brother. And he ended up setting the Library of Alexandria on fire by accident while trying to burn some ships. Imagine being the guy who accidentally destroys the greatest collection of human knowledge because you were having a bad day at the harbor. He then spent months lounging around on the Nile with Cleopatra, while his enemies were regrouping back in Rome. His advisors were begging him to come back and finish the war. But Caesar was too busy living his best life in the sun. He finally decided to leave, but only after he had secured his place in the history books. as the most romantic and also most annoying house guest in Egyptian history. When he finally returned to Rome, he decided that being a dictator for life wasn't enough. So he started accepting divine honors. He wanted to be a god while he was still breathing, which is the ultimate red flag in a republic. He started wearing high red boots like the ancient kings of Rome and sat on a golden throne in the Senate. He even changed the calendar because he felt like the old one was too messy. We still live with the Julian calendar today, which means every time you look at the month of July, you are looking at a permanent monument to one man's massive ego. He was a man who lived by the philosophy that if you do something big enough, people will stop calling it a crime and start calling it destiny. But the thing about being a problematic genius is that eventually people get tired of your nonsense. His habit of showing mercy to his enemies was seen by some as a virtue, but to the Roman elite, it was the ultimate insult. By pardoning them, he was asserting that he was superior to them, and that they weren't even worth killing. It was a subtle form of psychological warfare that ended up being his undoing. The men he spared were the ones who eventually sharpened their daggers for the Ides of March. As I sit here and reflect on his life, it's clear that Caesar wasn't a god because of some divine right. He was a god because he refused to believe he was anything less. He used dumb tactics and took insane risks because he had an unshakable confidence that the universe would bend to his will. And for a long time it did. He was a man of high arousal emotions and deep resentments, and he used every bit of that fire to forge an empire. He was the original anti-hero who was too charismatic to hate and too dangerous to love. Looking back at his story, it reminds me of all those other historical figures who were pushed to the limit and finally snapped. He was like the Maria Oktyabrskaya of ancient Rome, but instead of a tank, he used a legion. And instead of a husband to avenge, he was avenging his own wounded pride. Such is life, as the outlaws say, and Caesar's life was as legendary as it was messy. He proved that sometimes the most effective tactic isn't the smartest one, but the one that nobody else would be crazy enough to try. He was a walking contradiction, a man who could write beautiful poetry while planning a massacre, and a man who could be loved by his soldiers while being loathed by his peers. He was a problematic genius in every sense of the word, and the world has never been the same since he decided that 20 talents just wasn't enough for his head. I want to thank you for spending these minutes with me and giving me your attention while we explore the darker side of history's greatest minds. It is a small victory for focus in an age of distraction, and I appreciate you being here. Let's keep this conversation going in the comments. And tell me which part of Caesar's madness was your favorite. Don't forget to like, follow, and comment to stay part of this community. We have so many more stories to tell, and I want you to be fully here to hear them. Caesar's end was just as dramatic as his beginning. He went to the Senate on that fateful day despite all the warnings and bad omens, because he couldn't stand the thought of appearing afraid. He was a man who lived for the theater of power, and he died in the most theatrical way possible. Even as he was being struck down, he supposedly tried to cover his face with his toga to maintain his dignity. He was a performer until the very last second. His death didn't bring back the Republic. It just created a vacuum that was filled by even more chaos, and eventually by his heir Augustus, who was much more calculated, but far less interesting. Caesar was the spark that set the old world on fire, and we are still sifting through the ashes. to understand how one man with a massive ego and a collection of weird tactics could change the course of human history forever. He was the demon king of Rome who loved the shade of young saplings and the roar of the crowd. And he will forever be remembered as the man who turned a pirate's ransom into a divine legacy. In the end, the most disturbing thing about Caesar isn't that he was a tyrant. It's that he was right about how easy it is to manipulate the human heart through audacity. He knew that people are drawn to strength even when that strength is unhinged. He played the game of power with a level of discipline and madness that would make a samurai blush. And he won the ultimate prize. He became a name that would be synonymous with power for 2,000 years. Every Kaiser and Tsar in history was just an echo of his name. He was a man who lived a life that was truly epic in the real world, and he didn't need an algorithm to tell him he was famous. He just needed 50 talents and a very long memory for revenge. So as you go about your day, remember that the world isn't always won by the smartest people, but by the ones who are bold enough to demand more from life and from their enemies. Let's make our lives legendary in the real world just like Caesar did, but maybe with a little less crucifixion and a little more self-awareness. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next story of brilliance and madness. Don't forget to check out the other videos on the channel if you want more high-level historical gossip with zero filter. We are just getting started, and there are so many more idols to knock off their pedestals. Looking back at his final moments, it's almost poetic that he was killed by the very system he tried to outrun. He was a man who couldn't be caught by pirates or Gauls or Pompey, but he couldn't escape the resentment of his own peers. He was a genius who forgot that even a god needs to watch his back. His story is a warning and an inspiration, a testament to what happens when you combine raw talent with a complete lack of fear. He was the original problematic genius, and his shadow still looms over every person who dares to think they can rule the world. So stay curious, stay skeptical, and never take a ransom at face value. I'm going to go now and reflect on my own price tag, and I expect you all to do the same. Until next time, remember that history is written by the winners, but it's the problematic ones who make it worth reading. Don't forget to like, follow, and comment. Such is life.